Chapter 31 of Mad Barbara by Warwick Deeping. Chapter 31. John Gore made his retreat from Thorn with nothing more threatening in the way of a betrayal than a low, querulous growl from the mastiff chained in the yard. He scaled the gate, and made his way back to the thorn tree where he had left his heavier clothes and his sword. Now the sea captain's brain might have been a Spanish treasure ship, and the happenings of the night so many buccaneers, by the way they stormed in and put everything to confusion. There were 100 questions to be asked and answered, and many of them were the worst of riddles. The night sky seemed full of new meanings, new mysteries, new secrets, and Thorn itself a strange dim place where the heart of a man might lose itself in wonder. Yet one truth shone out like a great star above the tower, steady and sure amid so many drifting clouds. He had found the girl with the white face and the dusky hair, and learned that she was no more mad than he was, and for that he gave God thanks. But setting the romance and the tenderness thereof aside for a moment, John Gore found himself face to face with some very sinister and savage questions. Plodding back over the grass toward the beech thicket where he had left his horse, he began to scan the past as he walked, beating up memories with the keenness of a lawyer sifting evidence. Why had they mewed the girl up in this ruin of a place? Why had they lied to him about her madness? What had they to fear from her, that they had made such a secret of the thing? Barbara herself had seemed haunted by some hidden anguish, some mysterious dread that had made her shudder at the simplest question. He recalled all that he had heard concerning her, the mystery of her father's death, her moodiness and silence, the fears my lord had expressed as to her state of mind. He retold, piece by piece, the tale his father had told him on the night of his return from Yorkshire in September. Why had they gotten her into their power, made some pretence of madness, and shut her up with such keepers, and at the mercy of a ruffian's fist? The inevitable answer was that Barbara had discovered some secret that my Lord Gore and her mother were fiercely compelled to conceal. It had not been madness on her part, but perhaps too much knowledge, that had led them to seize such sinister methods. As for the secret itself, the core and pith of the whole mystery, he could only recall the tale his father had told him, and knit his brows over it like a man meeting the sleet of a storm. Now John Gore was a man of action, and as such laid his plans that night. He was going to take Barbara out of Thorn, for all the plots and intrigues and miserable shadows of shame the whole world might boast. There was the fellow Grylls to be dealt with, his father's creature, and though his heart smote him at the thought of it, he was grimly determined to lose no chance. Whatever authority the man might have, he might at least be robbed of information. Captain Grylls would probably spend the night at Thorn, and might be dealt with when he sallied out in the morning. A night watch in the woods opened for John Gore. He and his horse would have to make the best of such quarters as they had, the shelter of the beeches and the litter of leaves and bracken. John Gore swung himself into the fork of a tree, and wrapping his cloak about him, sat looking toward Thorn, his heart full of the night's adventures. The darker thoughts drifted aside for a season, and he thought only of the woman whose womanhood meant so much to him. He found himself wondering at the change in her, for never before had she shown her true self to him, with its flood of pathos, simplicity, and passion. A few moments at a window, a touch of the hands, and they were sharing life and its impulses together. He thought of the long cold nights in that tower room, the loneliness, the forebodings, the burden of past sorrow. It was easy to understand how the less lovable pride in her had been broken, and how with tears her womanhood had come by its true strength. The very sound of her voice had seemed richer to him. The change in her was a change that no true man would ever quarrel with. Though mists rose and a frail moon came up to make the dark woods seem more raw and cold, John Gore kept watch all night in the fork of the beech tree, thinking of Barbara and of the strange things he had discovered. He saw the dawn steal slowly into the east, and with the first grey light thereof, the flutter of something white at the upper window of the tower. But with the day and the sound of the stirring birds, John Gore came down out of the beech tree, for there was work before him, and he had made his plans. There were his pistols to be cleaned and primed, his horse to be given a canter for both their sakes, and a crop at the grass in the forest ride. He still had some victuals left him, and John Gore made a meal under the tree where he had spent the night, keeping an eye on Thorn for a glimpse of Captain Grylls. Nor had the gossamer and the dew shone for long in the sunlight before he saw a horseman ride out from the gate of Thorn, and push on slowly toward the forest track. Captain Grylls was jogging along peacefully that morning, thinking of such things as a man thinks of when he feels fat and warm: the money he is making, the clever things he may have done, or the woman he happens to fancy for the moment, when he heard the sound of a horse's hoofs sucking wet grass, and the creak and jingle of harness. The track had broadened into an open place with a number of great oak trees spreading their branches over it, so that they made a golden dome, with the turf green and sleek beneath. A man on horseback appeared suddenly amid the oak trees, riding at a canter under the sweeping boughs, with his hat over his eyes as though to save his face from the hazel twigs of the track. The stranger bore down straight on Captain Grylls, though that worthy shouted lustily and tried to get his horse out of the path. And even before he could curse the clumsy folly of the thing, his horse went down like a rammed wall, throwing him heavily, and crushing one leg badly under his flank. Captain Grylls was stunned, and lay there on his back with his mouth open, a great gobbet of wet mud on his forehead. His nag picked himself up, shook himself till the harness rattled, and then stood quietly staring at the stranger, who had blundered into him like a cavalry horse at the charge. John Gore was out of the saddle and bending over Captain Grylls. The fellow was far from dead, though conveniently senseless. John Gore opened his coat, searched his pockets, and found in a brown leather pocket-book a little package about the size of a man's palm, wrapped in a piece of paper that looked like the torn-out fly-leaf of a book. The packet was tied up with worsted and roughly sealed. John Gore took the thing, slipping the leather pocket-book back again into its place. Then he turned his attention to Captain Grylls' horse, taking out that gentleman's pistols, scattering the powder, and rubbing wet mud into the pans. He searched the holsters and the saddle-bags, but found nothing but a pipe and a paper of tobacco, some food, a change of undergear, and a bottle of wine. He had put the things back again when Captain Grylls came to his senses and sat up. With the first clearing of his wits, he had laid a hand to his bruised ankle, and began to swear like a buccaneer at the man who had ridden into him so clumsily. "Teeth and hair of the Almighty, you blind sot of a jackass! Isn't there enough road for you to ride to blazes without blundering into better men than yourself? What the devil do you mean by it, you Sussex clod, you bumpkin, you lousy yeoman? Give us a hand, can't you? Wet grass ain't anything of a cushion, especially when a man has no change of small clothes with him." He glanced at John Gore, but did not seem to recognize him, and getting upon his feet, limped to and fro a while, cursing. Then he began slapping his pockets with his hands to make sure that his purse and pocket-book were there, looking at John Gore the while out of the corners of his eyes. "I have not had anything in the way of an apology yet, sir," he said. John Gore lifted his hat, watching Captain Grylls carefully, to see whether his lack of recognition was a blind or no. He remembered that he had had the collar of his coat turned up that night in the park, and that he himself might not have recognized Grylls but for the wryness of his figure. "Most certainly I offer you my apologies, sir. I was in a hurry, and had taken a bridle track, having business Hastings way by 8." John Gore coarsened himself to the likeness of a gentleman farmer in his best clothes. "You will crack your skull and spill your business if you ride about in such fashion. We Sussex folk have hard heads." "And no manners either," quoth the man in the brown coat, glancing rather threateningly at the pistol-holders on his saddle. He limped up to his horse and examined the saddle-bag to see that his things were there. Then he jammed his hat down on his head, looked sourly at his muddy clothes, and passed a hand over the wettest portion of his figure. A nice start for a 30-mile ride. I shall have to bait somewhere and dry my breeches. A day in the saddle, then? Tunbridge to-night, London to-morrow." He put his foot in the stirrup and climbed up heavily, grunting and swearing to ease his temper. "I wish you a clear road, sir," he said, with sarcasm. "You would do well to lead a charge of horse." "I can only assure you of my regrets, my dear sir. We farmer gentry ride fast when there is a marriage to be arranged." Captain Grylls tilted his nose. "Green youth, green youth," he said sententiously. "In 10 years, my lad, you will break your neck riding to be rid of the sweet thing's temper. Let the blood be hot for a month or two, till she begins to scold in bed instead of kissing." John Gore laughed. "You are a man of experience, sir. Well, I must not waste your time, or my own." The man in the brown coat went away with a jeer. "Spend your time on a wife, my lad, and you'll waste it. Learn to spend it on other men's wives. Steal the kisses and leave them the scratches." "Good morning to you, sir. I wish I had some spare small clothes to lend you." "They'll dry in the saddle, Master Numskull, or I'll sit with my back to the next fire I come across." And he went off at a trot into the autumn woods. John Gore led his horse aside among the oak trees, and proceeded to examine the package that he had taken from Captain Grylls. On the paper was roughly scrawled "My Lord," and breaking the seal and the worsted, he found nothing more astonishing than a mass of wool pressed tightly together. But as he unravelled the stuff, he came upon something hard that glistened, a gold ring set with a seal and bound round with a piece of red silk. The seal was an intaglio cut in sardonyx, a gorgon's head, with a hand holding a firebrand above it. John Gore knew it to be his father's signet ring, and this circle of gold, with its seal, cast out all doubt as to my lord's authority in the matter. That ring might carry his father's orders to and fro without his compromising himself by putting pen to paper. John Gore wondered what the piece of red silk meant. The message it carried might have some sinister meaning, for the mystery and the secrecy of it all had drawn many dark thoughts into his mind. How far would Captain Grylls ride before discovering the loss of the packet? Would he return, or ride on ahead for London? Above all, what message had he carried to Thorn, and had his coming foreshadowed some peril for Barbara? John Gore had thought of holding Captain Grylls at the pistol point and forcing a confession from him, but he had realized the rashness of such a measure, nor could he have proved that the rogue was telling him the truth. Captain Grylls might be a mere dispatch rider, knowing nothing of the news he carried. It would be wiser to let him go his way without his discovering who was meddling in the plot. John Gore put the ring upon his finger, mounted his horse, and made for the main road. He needed a place where he could lie quiet, and people whom he could trust, and Furze Farm was such a place. He made for it that morning, guided by the shouts of a man whom he found ploughing in a field, and before noon he rode down the grass track that Mr. Pepys had followed, and saw the red farmhouse, the dark thatch, the yellow stacks, and the golden beeches against a breezy sky. As he came riding by Chris Jennifer's orchard, he saw Mrs. Winnie hanging linen out to dry, while white-polled Will paddled round the pond and surreptitiously threw sticks at the white ducks thereon. Mrs. Winnie's blue petticoat was blowing merrily, and she had a clothes-peg in her mouth when John Gore called to her over the hedge. She dropped the peg suddenly, while the wind blew an apron across her face. "Good morning, Mrs. Jennifer." "Drat the clothes! Who be it this time of the morning, and me with a short petticoat on?" She flicked the apron aside, settled her skirts, and came round under a great apple tree, with a few pullets running at her heels. "Good morning, Mrs. Jennifer." "Sakes alive! Is it you, sir?" "Yes, come to ask you a favour. You had better keep an eye on that boy of yours. He still seems in love with the pond." She moved along the hedge, smoothing her brown hair down, and showing the muscle in her big brown arms. "Come in, sir, and be welcome. Will, you little frummit, what be you doing there, terrifying all of us with puddling round in the mud?" She opened the gate for John Gore and gave him a courtesy, for Winnie Jennifer had served as a woman in a great house, and her manners and her speech were less quaint than Mr. Christopher's. "Come in, sir. My man will be up from the ploughland soon. Dinner will be coming, though it be only rough stuff." John Gore dismounted, and made Mrs. Winnie a slight bow. "You offered me your good will," he said frankly, "and I have come to take it, as a friend." He led his horse toward the stable, while Chris Jennifer's wife bustled into the house, putting washing day behind her with good–natured patience. John Gore found her going into the little old parlour with her apron full of sticks, but he protested that the kitchen ingle–nook would do for him, and that he liked the smell of dinner. So he sat himself down in the nook, under the hood of the great fireplace, stretching his legs out to the fire, and wondering what he would say to Christopher Jennifer's wife. There was a pot boiling over the fire, and Mrs. Winnie began to gather her flour and things upon the table for the making of a pudding. She took a great pot of preserves from a cupboard, and set to work very sensibly in her practical brown–armed way. "If I had known, sir, I wouldn't have put an old one in the pot." "Old one?" "One of the old hens, sir. They're not so bad when you boil 'em. I'll make up some herb sauce to help the old lady down." Now, whether it was the warmth of the fire, or the frank freshness of Mrs. Winnie's manner, John Gore found himself telling her enough of the truth to set the woman in her heartily at his service. She forgot her pudding in her sympathy, even so far as to stir the air with a wooden spoon, and to spill jam upon the table. John Gore had come to the pith of the matter when he saw her flourish the spoon threateningly in the direction of the back–yard door. "Will, you little spying rogue, get you out and look for the eggs." "There ain't none," came the retort. "T' birds be moultin'." "Don't answer me, young man. Do what I tell ye." And she made a step forward that sent the youngster running for fear of the spoon. Mrs. Winnie turned to her pudding, casting a look now and again at the grim brown–faced man in the ingle–nook. "You move me powerful, sir. As sure as I love my man, sir, coming to him as a clean maid as I did, with all my linen and my savings, if it be no liberty on my part, I'll ask to serve you as you please. Come into this house as yours, sir. Come and go, and we'll ask no questions. My man and I will thank God for it, that we can give you service for what you did." John Gore felt that he could trust her, and Mrs. Winnie had no less trust in him. She was a shrewd woman, with some knowledge of the world in her own blunt way, and more sentiment and warmth in her than one would have guessed by the masterfulness of her manner. "I shall be very grateful to you," said the man, simply. "Why, there, sir, it's little enough. There shan't be any poking of noses round Furze Farm, I can tell you that. I have a tongue, and my man is a man of sense. Order your own going, sir, and we'll just mind our business." She could not have shown her good sense or her honour better than by taking the matter as she did, but when John Gore spoke of his more tangible debt to her, she stirred the pudding hard, and would have none of his protests. "No, sir, we have got good crops in, 3 milking cows, a yard full of pullets, all stuff off our own ground. It's just our own stuff, and we shall thank you to eat of it, though it be a bit rough, and not puffed up for a gentleman's table. Charge you 6pence when we kill a chicken, or a penny when I take a bowl of apples down out of the attic? Dear life, sir, not me. My hands aren't made that way." Chris Jennifer came in about dinner–time, heralding his approach by kicking his muddy boots against the stone step at the yard door. He came in and received John Gore and his wife's orders without so much as a blink of surprise. He stared hard at his guest for half a minute or so, and then took a big jug from the shelf over the fireplace. "I'll tap t' new cask," he said, as though that would be his warmest welcome. "Put some apples to sizzle, my dear. S'pose thee'll be airing t' best sheets?" "Go on with you," said his wife, bluntly. "Do you think I be one to forget such a thing?" Mr. Jennifer lumbered round to her, stood by her solemnly a moment, and then gave her a very deliberate dig under the arm. "T' woman stole gentleman Adam's rib. Mindings be mendings." And he went off with a chuckle toward the pantry, leaving John Gore to disentangle the meaning of so solemn a jest. CHAPTER 32. Chapter 32 of Mad Barbara by Warwick Deeping. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 32. Little Dr. Hemstruther, in his rusty clothes, came out from my Lady Purcell's house and entered the chair that was in waiting for him, telling the men to carry him to my Lord Gore's in St. James's Street. He took snuff vigorously as the two chairmen swung along over the cobbles, patted his chest, and beat his hands together to keep them warm. His unwholesome face had a beaky, bird-like alertness, and he appeared cynically amused by something, for Dr. Hemstruther delighted in the quaint inconsistencies of human nature, and had a fanatical hatred of all altruism and the sentiment of religion. Like many sour old men, he was hugely pleased when he had discovered anything mean and scandalous, and yet he was to be trusted in the keeping of a secret, his cynical temper helping him to cover up the follies of those who filled his purse. He merely jeered and mocked at them in philosophic privacy, taking their money and mocking his own self for being the creature of such hire. The chairmen stopped before the house in St. James's Street, Dr. Hemstruther waiting in the chair till the house door opened, for a keen north-west wind was sweeping the street. Toddling in at last, a shrewd, meagre figure, his long nose poking forward between the curls of his huge wig, he was shown by the man Rogers into a little room at the back of the house where Stephen Gore kept his books and papers. Dr. Hemstruther was warming his hands at the fire when my lord came in to him, his florid cheerfulness struggling to shine through a cloud of anxiety and unrest. His suit of sky-blue satin, the lace ruffles at his wrists, the very rings upon his fingers, seemed part of a radiance that was wilfully assumed. A keen eye could detect a certain hollowness in the face, a bagginess beneath the eyes, some slackness of the muscles about the mouth. The silky gloss of his fine manner betrayed through the very beauty of its texture the darker moods and thoughts beneath. Dr. Hemstruther noted and commented on all this as he bowed his lean little body and rubbed his hands for fear of chilblains. And Dr. Hemstruther despised my lord, though he covered up his sneers with subserviency and unction. For my Lady Purcell had fallen sick of the smallpox some days ago, and in her panic and distress of soul was sending my lord messages, which he, brave gentleman, put discreetly to one side. "Well, sir, what news to-day?" Dr. Hemstruther carried a very solemn face for the occasion. "Great peril, my lord, great peril." "What, no better?" "A threatening of malignancy, my lord." A flash of impatience escaped from Stephen Gore. "What is your experience worth, Dr. Hemstruther, if you cannot handle a woman with a fever? The greater part of our earthly wisdom is a mere matter of words." He walked to the window and opened it. "Poor Nan Purcell to have escaped so long with a clean skin! There will be much weeping and gnashing of teeth and covering up of mirrors." The petulance in his voice betrayed his resentment at the lack of improvement in her affairs. Her sickness was infinitely mischievous at such a moment, and inspired him with an uneasy and savage impatience. He flung down into a chair, with all his sweet loftiness in peril of toppling into a snarl of unseemly temper. Dr. Hemstruther appeared to be intent upon brushing some of the snuff from his coat. "The danger is not skin-deep, sir," he said. "You find yourself quite helpless, Dr. Hemstruther, eh? There, pardon my peevishness. I would not venture the weight of a feather either way, my lord, and she is a bad patient. Mens turbida in corpore aegro." He sniffed, smoothed his wig, and looked deferentially at his shoes. "My Lady Purcell is asking for you, my lord." "Then she is conscious of everything?" "Conscious to the quick, in spite of the heat of the fever. If I may be pardoned—" His eyes met my lord's, and Stephen Gore was the more embarrassed of the two. "You think that I should do her good?" "More good, my lord." "Than all your draughts and bleedings?" Dr. Hemstruther bowed and hid a smile with the obeisance. my Lord Gore might find some words to soothe the lady. But you forget, man, that—" He did not complete the sentence, for even his egotism stumbled at the confession of the instinct of cowardice and self-love. Dr. Hemstruther understood him, and mocked inwardly at the great man's prudence. "There is some danger, my lord, but still I would advise—" "As a matter of policy?" "As a matter of policy." Stephen Gore pushed back his chair and stood at his full height, as though he felt the need of feeling himself taller than this little crab of a man who knew so much, and whose authority was so obsequious and yet so strong. "Women have no patience, sir, and will scream fire when a log falls on the hearth. I'm up to my eyes in a rush of affairs to-day, and my friends will thank me if I breathe a pest into all their faces." "To-morrow would serve, my lord." "I may take your word for that? Good. Are there any cautions you would give me?" Dr. Hemstruther screwed his face into an expression of intense sagacity. "I will send you a powder to burn, my lord, and a mild draught to clear you. Sit by an open window, and have all the clothes you go in burned." "My thanks. And now, sir, if you will pardon me, my leisure is not my own." He unlocked a cabinet, took out a silk purse, and, crossing the room, held the purse out to the physician. "I'm exerting myself in that little affair of yours, Dr. Hemstruther," he said. "It is a pleasure to labour for one's friends." Both smiled faintly as they looked into each other's eyes. Dr. Hemstruther put the purse away in an inner pocket and made one of his most courtly bows. "Your servant, my lord. I trust that I am mindful of all your interests." And he went out, sniffing, to wrinkle up his nose sardonically like a grinning dog, so soon as he was out of Stephen Gore's sight. But if Anne Purcell burned with a fever upon her bed, whimpering and calling continually on Mrs. Jael, who had taken a heavy bribe to bide beside her lady, my Lord Gore was in an equal fever of mind, the fever of a man who has many things to dread. He knew enough of human heart to remember that the cords of silence char and slacken when death holds the torch to the secrets of the past. A panic of penitence, the betrayal of others in the mad impulse to make amends, the emotions thirsting for the comfort of the confessional dew. And Stephen Gore was wise as to the gravity of a betrayal, for the man Grylls had ridden into Sussex, and Anne Purcell knew it, and the sealed order that he carried. Moreover, this blood debt was not the only stain that darkened my lord's consciousness. He was sunk to the chin in other and wider waters, where the breath from a hired creature's lips might stir such a storm as should smother death into the mouths of many. He stood before the fire, staring into it, and turning the rings upon his fingers. For the moment it was all self with him, self, savage, querulous, impatient, driven to that height of fanaticism whence the sorrows and hopes of a man's fellows seem infinitely small and insignificant. It was the mad, angry self that beats down and tramples on the life instincts of others, crying a savage sacrifice to the Moloch of the ego. And yet this man in the satin coat, so bland, so debonair, so generous on the surface, heard the low clamour of that underworld that every man carries in the deeps of consciousness. He suffered, yet would not countenance his suffering, hardening himself to escape from it with the fierce strength and subtlety and anger. End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of Mad Barbara by Warwick Deeping. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 33. If Winnie Jennifer was not in love with John Gore, she was in love with the love in him, for no man could sit and stare so at the fire and look so quietly grim over such a matter without winning over a woman's heart. There was a romance here, and your true woman, be she drudge or madam, has that trick of the fancy that lifts life out of its sordid round and makes her a queen of the fairies, though there be grey in her hair. And when he looked at Winnie with those deepest eyes of his, she knew that he was looking beyond her toward his love,
and that the heart in him said, "I must go to her, for she has suffered." Therefore, when John Gore rose up from the ingle-nook about 3 in the afternoon, and asked her whether Mr. Jennifer could lend him several fathoms of good rope, Mrs. Winnie regarded him with a curious glint of the eyes, and felt a delight in meddling in such a matter. "To be sure, sir, there is a good round of rope hanging on a harness-peg in the stable. Come you, we will see." She went out with him, swinging her brown arms, and holding her head high, as though proud in her woman's way of sharing in the adventure, and, opening the stable door, showed him a hank of brown rope hanging from the wood. "How much would you be wanting, sir?" "10 fathoms will do." He took the hank down, and, laying it on the floor, began to measure the rope out, yard by yard, coiling it neatly close by Mrs. Winnie's feet. It was good hemp, unfrayed and unrotted, not too thick and stiff, yet stout enough to carry the weight of 3 men. Mrs. Winnie watched him, her eyes inquisitively kind, and her tongue all of a tremble. He was borrowing the rope in the cause of adventure, and she felt flattered in the lending of it, but she wished he would tell her what it was for. "It is good hemp, sir." "I should know a good rope, being a sailor. I shall need it to help me in a bit of a scramble." Mrs. Winnie began to think of all the cliffs and quarries in the neighbourhood, for John Gore had withheld the name of Thorn. "I had better get you a wallet full of food, sir. You may be needing it." "You think of everything, Mrs. Jennifer. I am going treasure-hunting." And he laughed. "Treasure, sir?" "Yes. In a few days I may bring my treasure-trove back with me." Mrs. Winnie understood of a sudden, and her eyes grew full of light. "No doubt she is all you desire, sir, and I ask no more questions of you. You have told me enough before to make me want to take and comfort her." She went away, and returned anon with an extra cloak, a parcel of bread and meat, some apples, and a drop of good Hollands in a flask, for the autumn nights were growing raw and cold. John Gore had saddled his horse and hung the rope over one of the holsters. He looked touched by Mrs. Winnie's simple kindliness, and by the faith she seemed ready to give to him. "I shall have a heavy debt before long," he said. "We don't count by tallies here, sir." And she was quite happy, good soul, in feeling his gratitude pledge its truth. She watched him ride away along the hedge, knowing him for a brave man and a strong one, a man whom a woman instinctively respects. Now at Thorn, Simon Pinniger sat on a tree-stump in an outhouse, lazily splitting billets of wood with the axe-edge of a pick. It was growing dusk, and a pile of white wood lay beside him, with here and there the pink core of an old apple-trunk amid the billets of oak and ash. Simon Pinniger was tired of the job, and, filling a basket with split logs, he shouldered it and crossed the courtyard into the kitchen, and dumped the basket down beside the hearth with the air of a man whose day's work was done. The woman Nance was at the table, peeling apples for a pie, her lips pressed intently together, and 3 hard lines running across her forehead. The man looked at her a little furtively, and then went to draw some beer from a cask that stood in the corner. He put the jug on the floor under the tap, so that the ale should have a head on it, and stood there watching the liquor flow with the stupid slouching pose of a man whose body was too big for his brain. "Sim!" The sharp rasp of the woman's voice brought him round as though she had clouted him on the ear. "What are you thinking of, man?" The red-lidded eyes behind the eyelet holes of the linen looked capable of expressing nothing but fleshly things. "Supper," he said curtly. "Well, you'll wait for it. Quick, you fool, the liquor's running over." He turned and put a hand to the spigot, muttering as a rivulet of good ale curled across the floor. "All your tongue, as usual." "It's always my tongue, Sim, and never your lumpishness. Wipe that slop up. I'm not going to soil my shoes in it." He obeyed her, and then sat himself on the 3-legged stool before the fire, taking the jug with him, and standing it on the hearth. "There's comfort in the stuff," he said sullenly. The woman gave a sharp laugh. "Courage, you mean. You 6 feet and a half of fat and folly. You would run away from it all but for me." "Run?" "Yes, you." "You want a week of the branks, my dear. Give me my money and my liquor, and I'm the bully for any man." "Oh, you're a fine fat falcon, you. Keep a little courage in the cask, Sim, till the business comes. 3 days' grace and no countermand. What's it to be? A mattress, or a fathom of rope, or a soft scarf? What are you looking so sulky about?" For the man had bunched himself over the fire, and was rocking backward and forward on 2 legs of the stool. "Let it alone, you fool," he said. "It don't do a man good to think of such things." She looked up mockingly, and threw a half-rotten apple at him. "Oh, you soft head! You piece of pulp! You're no better than a great girl, you who pulled Adam Naylor's windpipe out and broke in that Frenchman's chest. You to make such a blubber over this!" "Who's afraid?" he asked savagely. "My sweet conscience. Oh, dear, good saints! I'm a poor sinner, a poor snivelling sinner. Nance, shut your trap!" And he opened his chest and roared at her with sudden fury. She took it with a laugh. "Better, Sim, better. Put a little temper into it. I'll give you a pint of Hollands when the night comes, and smack you across the face with a firebrand to make you mad." And she filled her apron with the apple peelings, and came and tossed them into the fire. A west wind blew fitfully about the tower of thorn, the ivy rustled, leaf tapping against leaf, and the clouds passed slowly across the stars. An owl was beating up and down the edge of a neighbouring wood, hooting as he went, now strangely near, now faint in the distance. From the courtyard came the dull burr of the dog's chain as he fidgeted in his kennel. Barbara had been at war with herself all day, distraught, troubled, afraid to believe that which she most desired. And with the dusk her uneasiness and her wavering suspense had deepened, heralding an anguish of self-hatred and humiliation that shirked the ordeal of another meeting. She dreaded lest John Gore should come, and yet listened for his coming, fearing and longing for him in one breath, the past and present fighting for her desire. Twice she rolled up the sheets to succour him in his climb, and twice she unrolled them with a fever of indecision. Her heart laboured with the secret that it held, striving against the untellable, yet trying to beat out nothing but the truth. There was that eternal blood debt between them, lurid to her, now that the night had come, like the glare of a fire reddening the sky. Barbara walked to and fro a while, and then stood listening, leaning against the wall. Nor had she been long motionless when there was a faint rustling of the ivy, a sound as of something moving, of something drawing near to her in the darkness. She climbed the bed and put her hands to the bars. A faint whisper came up to her out of the sibilant shiver of the leaves. "Barbara!" The fever of doubt and of fear left her suddenly. "John!" "Can you help me?" "Yes, wait." She was down instantly, rolling the sheets and knotting them into a rope. The strands of her hair were under the pillow. She took them and wound them round the knots, and, making them fast to a bar, threw the end thereof out of the window. But the rope would not run by its own weight, and she had to thrust it out foot by foot, standing on the bed and leaning her bosom against the wall. The rope tightened, the knots straining at the bar. Then a shadow blotted out the window. "Dear heart!" She stretched out her hands to him, and then drew them with a sharp sob into her bosom, bending down her head and feeling the old despair taking possession of her heart. "Barbe!" He had forced himself into the stone framing of the window, and she could hear him breathing hard with the grimness of the climb. "Where are you, child?" He lay there with his face to the bars, and heard nothing but sudden passionate weeping. The sound of it went through him to the heart. He stretched out an arm, and was able to touch her hair. "Dear heart, what is it?" She shivered and drew away. "You should not have come." "No, no." "John, you should not." My life, child, come, speak to me. I cannot bear to hear you weep." She knew that he was trying to touch her, to be nearer to her, even with all the deep tenderness of his manhood. It was so easy, and yet so difficult, so sweet, and yet so full of torment. She felt that she could not bear out against him, and yet, how could she tell? He spoke again. "Barbara!" And then, "Dear heart, do you not trust me?" Something seemed to break within her, and she thrust up her hands to him with a cry as of one drowning. "John, I am afraid! John, I am afraid! There, my life. Take my hands, hold them, keep me. I am afraid, John. Dear God, what can I say?" Her courage and her will had gone, and a storm of trembling shook her. John Gore felt the quivering of her body come along her arms to him. Her hands strained at his, as though he were the one sure thing left to her in the anguish of it all. "Barbara!" He drew her as close to him as bars and wall would suffer. "Tell me, child, everything." "I can't, John. Oh, I can't." "Dear, do you think there is not one heart in the world? Look up and tell me. I cannot let you go." She was silent a moment, still trembling greatly. "John, you will hate me." "No, no, no." "Your father—" His hands tightened on hers. "My life, my courage." "Your father killed my father, John." "Child!" "And I tried to win revenge." She buried her face upon her arms, and then lifted it suddenly toward him in the dark, as though in an agony to know what he was thinking. His hands still had hold of hers, and there was no slackening of his fingers. "John!" "Dear heart!" He bent his head, and drawing her hands to him, pressed his lips to them. Below him he could see the dim, appealing whiteness of her face. "Barbe, you should have told me." "I was mad." "Who shall judge us, dear? You should have told me. I might have spared you much." He drew her hands close into his bosom, and she leaned there, letting the tears flow silently and the sorrow in her take refuge in his strength. "You will not condemn me, John? You?" "I? What am I, child, to condemn you? But I have learned, and I have suffered, and, John, in the long, silent nights, I have prayed to God that he would be merciful to me, that I in turn might be more merciful." He kissed her hands again. "God is with us, child, here and now." "How good you are, John! If I could only tell him, and my mother." "Dear heart, let that rest awhile. It is you I pray for, you that I remember." He was silent a while, like a man waking to life from some strange dream. Then he pressed her hands in his, and spoke very dearly through the bars to her. "Barbe, I must get you away from here. I would do it without violence for your sake, for the sake of everyone. It would be easy for me to kill that man, but I would not have blood with the memory of this." She looked up at him and sighed. "Listen, you can trust me. I have a rope here round my body. Take it, when I am gone, and hide it in your bed. I will come again to-morrow and file these bars through. Do you know how the door is fastened?" "With lock and bar." "A tough customer. Do they leave you alone the whole night?" "Yes." "Time, an auger, and a good knife will serve then. I have a place to take you to. You will trust me in this?" "John, need you ask that?" "Dear heart of mine, no, no. Now for a rope's end. When I am safe below, I will give 3 twitches to the rope. Draw it up, dear, and hide it in your bed." "Yes." "And, child, if you are in danger, or fear anything, tear off a piece of linen and tie it to one of the bars. I shall storm in then without by your leave or welcome, and deal with those gentry at the point of the sword." He kissed her fingers, hung there a moment, and then unwound the rope from his body. Fastening it, he touched her hands through the bars of the window, and went down into the night. Chapter 33. Chapter 34 of Mad Barbara by Warwick Deeping. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 34. There were two link boys waiting outside Lord Gore's house in St. James's Street when a short, stumpy woman came hurrying along with the hood of her cloak down over her head. The street door of the house was open, and a servant waiting on the step with a fur cloak over one arm and a sword under the other. His master came out as the woman paused at the steps, a thin, swarthy, sallow man, with alert eyes and a brisk manner. He took the cloak from the servant and swung it over his shoulders, putting his chin up as he fastened the cloak, and making his lower lip protrude beyond the upper. Coming down the steps, he looked hard at the woman, who was leaning against the railings, a look that was half gallant, half suspicious, and even paused to stare in her face, as though he thought she might have some message for him. But since she hung back and waited for him to pass, and was, moreover, woolly and middle-aged, he gave an order to the link boys for the Savoy, and went away at a good fast stride, with the servant following at his heels. The woman ran up the steps and spoke to Tom Rogers, who was holding the door open and staring curiously after the retreating figure. Her voice was importunate and even threatening, so much so that he let her in and closed the door, and went about her business without demur, as though knowing that she had some right to hustle. My lord was in the little library at the back of the house, sorting and looking through a litter of papers on the table with a feverish, irritable air. There was a good fire burning, and charred fragments of paper littered the hearth and fluttered in through the draught at the throat of the chimney. My lord had taken a roll of letters, and was thrusting them into the heart of the fire with the tongs, when Rogers knocked at the door and entered upon privilege. His master glanced at him with a gleam of impatient distrust. "What is it now?" "My Lady Purcell's woman, sir." "Where?" "In the hall, my lord. She says that she must speak with you." Stephen Gore's face had the dusky look of a face gorged with blood from drinking. "Send her in, Rogers. Take warning. I am at home to no one, not even to the king." The roll of letters was a black mass spangled over with sparks and corroding lines of fire, when Mrs. Jael came in with the hood of her cloak turned back. She waited till Rogers had closed the door, and even then looked at it suspiciously, as though afraid that the fellow might be listening. Stephen Gore understood her meaning. He opened it, found the passage empty, and closing the door again, stood with his back to it and his hand upon the latch. "Your message?" Mrs. Jael fidgeted her arms under her cloak, and looked hot and a little scared. "My lady has sent me, my lord." "Well, well?" "She must see you to-night. She will take no denial. I am bidden to bring you back." Stephen Gore frowned at her didactic tone and the menace in her manner. "Indeed!" "She cannot bear it alone, my lord. She must speak with you. We fear that she is dying." "Dying?" "Yes, sir, yes. Don't curl your mouth at me. She bade me say that unless you come to her, she will—" The expression of my lord's face so frightened Mrs. Jael that her voice faltered away into an almost inaudible murmur. He stood staring at her, his flushed face seamed with the passions of a man whose courage and patience had already suffered, and on whom all the hazards of life were falling in one and the same hour. "I will come." He pressed back his shoulders, steadied his dignity, and crossed the room to where hat, cloak, and sword lay on a carved chair. His hands fumbled with the tags of the cloak as he fastened them. Mrs. Jael kept her distance as he walked toward the door, for there was a look in my lord's eyes that night that made her afraid of him. He was as a man driven to bay, and ready to stab at any one who should venture too near his person. Stephen Gore walked the short distance to Anne Purcell's house in grim silence, heartily cursing all women, and in no mood to humour a sick sinner. The whole thing was accursedly vexatious and inopportune, and he hardened himself against all sentiment with the savage impatience of a man who is harassed and menaced on every quarter. Mrs. Jael was a snivelling fool, an emotional creature who had helped to froth up her mistress's panic. Both of them, no doubt, needed ice to their heads, and a couple of gags to keep them quiet. Yet the great house was so solemn and dim and silent, and the woman's manner in tragic keeping therewith, that Stephen Gore felt chilled and uneasy as he followed her flickering candle up the stairs. The place seemed ghostly and deserted, full of dark corners, draughts, and mysterious empty rooms. Stephen Gore had come in with his pulses thrumming lustily, and the hot intent to put all this meddlesome nonsense out of his path. But the house had much of the eeriness of a moorland in a fog, with quags ready to suck at a man's feet, and a strange, vast silence to unnerve him. Mrs. Jael led him along a gallery, and opened a door at the end thereof. She stood back, waiting for him to cross the threshold, and then, as though she had had her orders, she swung the door to, and turned the key in the lock. Stephen Gore turned with a start, hesitated, biting his lip, and then let things take their course. The room was lit by a single candle. The boards and walls were bare, and there was little in it save the four-post bed. A great fire burned on the hearth, and the air felt hot and heavy, and full of the indescribable scent of sickness. "Stephen!" He forced back his shoulders, gave a tug to his cravat, and turned toward the bed. The curtains were drawn back, and on the white pillow he saw a dusky, swollen face, a face that might haunt a man till the day of his death. "Stephen, are you there?" My lord looked shocked despite himself, as though thinking of the face that he had kissed not many days ago. "Why, Nan, how is it with you?" Her breathing was laboured, her lips cracked and dry, and the hand that she stretched out to him swung up and down like a branch in the wind. "I cannot see you. My eyes are touched." He looked at her helplessly, half loathing the thing he saw, and yet unnerved by a blind rush of pity that beat and shook the pedestal of self. "Stephen, don't come near me if you are afraid." She might have reproached him with the pusillanimous prudence he had shown in keeping away from her until this night, and, vain woman that she had been, she felt that it was the threat alone that had brought him to her. Yet she spoke calmly at first, and feebly, like one who had come to a sense of awe and of the end. My lord put the best dignity he could upon it, but he felt the heat and the wilfulness in him growing cold. "You have sent for me, Nan." "It is not the first time." "I should have come before, but I have been pressed and driven by 100 things." Instinctively she turned her face toward him on the pillow, though she could not see him because the disease had blinded her. "Let us make no excuses to-night, Stephen. Do you know that I am dying?" "No, Nan, not that." She gave a long sigh, and her hands moved to and fro over the coverlet. "Yes, I am dying. You know why I have sent for you." "What is it you desire?" He stood looking at her in some astonishment and with unwilling awe, for she whom he had always led seemed mistress of herself under the shadow of death, and not the weeping, pleading, terrified thing that he had thought to find. "Stephen, you must go to-night." He faced up as though to attention. "Go? Where?" "Need I tell you that?" "My heart, you are ill and distraught." She raised herself on the pillow with a sudden energy of passion. Her poor marred face could not express it, but her voice had a deep, fierce thrill that came from the heart of the world. "Man, man, do not play with me to-night, as you have played with me these many years." "Anne, if you will listen to me." "Listen? What have I to hear? This thing lies in my throat and stifles me. I cannot bear it. I cannot bear to die with it, smothering my breath." He breathed out and tried to hold himself in hand. "Nan, it is impossible." "No, no." "I cannot go to-night. There are matters, affairs that it would be death to me to leave. I tell you, my honour is pledged here." She held out a rigid arm toward him, her blurred, sightless eyes at gaze. "Stephen, I warn you—" "I tell you, you do not understand." "Your honour. You weigh your honour against this thing. Stephen, I warn you." "For God's sake, listen. No, no. Save the child, I charge you, or before I die I will tell the truth." Her hand dropped and then went to her throat, for a spasm of choking seized her, and he could see the muscles straining in her throat and her dry lips praying for air. Stephen Gore thought that death had her that instant, but the strength of her purpose bore her through. "Stephen, promise me." He held out his hands appealingly, helplessly, but the gesture was lost upon her blindness. "Promise." "It is impossible." "Man, have you ever loved any one but yourself? Have you never stood on the edge of the world and looked over into darkness? I cannot go to it, with this thing stifling me. Stephen, I ask you, if you have ever loved me, do this last mercy." He walked to and fro with a quick, rigid step, and paused at the far end of the room, feeling the air hot and poisonous, and the blood drumming at his temples. "I am to sacrifice myself, Nan? You ask that?" She propped herself upon the pillow, her head swaying slightly from side to side. "I ask you not to face your God, Stephen, with more blood upon your hands." He cried out at her with bitterness. "Woman, what can I do?" "What I have asked. Ride down to Thorn to-night. And, Stephen, do not think that I shall die so soon that you can play with me and shirk it. You may wish that I were dead now, and silent." He leaned against the wall, spreading his arms against it, as though to steady himself. "Before God, Nan, not that." "Stephen, if you have ever loved me, do not stoop to play a coward's trick upon me now." He leaned there against the wall, almost like a man crucified, his face haggard, his forehead agleam with sweat. He had come to temporize, to dissuade, to cheat the truth with a few glib words, and he found the heart plucked out of him, and his self beaten against its anger and its will. "Nan, I will go." "There is time yet." "A night and a day." She held out her hands as though with a piteous sense of loneliness and leave-taking, but though he was humbled, shaken, he could not look into her face. "Nan, I will go. Let that help you to live. What will come of it, God alone can tell." She felt instinctively, through all the tumult of it, that he could not look at her without a shudder, he who had always loved sun and colour and richness about him, a soft skin and pleasant lips. Yet she was too near the veil, too close upon the eternal mystery, to cry out over a lost desire. "Stephen, for God's sake, go." She fell back on the pillow as he turned to the door and shook it, forgetting in the chaos of his thoughts that the woman Jael had turned the key. He beat upon the panels with his fists, and when the door opened for him, pushed past her without a word, and went heavily down the dark stairway to the hall where he had left his cloak and sword. My Lord Gore was within 20 yards of his own house when a figure that had been loitering in the shadow came slantwise across the road to meet him, and stopped on the footway as he passed. My lord had a glimpse of a pair of shining eyes and the white oval of a man's face between the drooping brim of a beaver and the upturned collar of a cloak. "Good night, my lord. Fugax solvendo non sumus." He was pushing on with nothing more than a low, soft whistle, when Stephen Gore caught him by the arm. "Blake!" "Softly, for God's sake, sir. I have loitered here for half an hour to give you the wink and the text." My lord still gripped his arm. "What is it, man?" "Boot and saddle for me, sir, before midnight, and the godsend of a boat across the Channel. Coleman's correspondence has been seized." "The fool! The Jesuit fool!" "The poor devil will be in the Protestant purgatory soon, sir. If you are wise, ride, ride. There will be bigger titles than yours, my lord, bumping in the saddle to-night." He looked about him uneasily, and then freed himself quietly from Stephen Gore's grip. "Your pardon, sir, but the hawks will soon be on the wing for some of us poor popish pigeons. Good night." "Blake, thanks for this." "Nonsense, sir. You helped me once, and I am an Irishman. Good night." He went away at a good pace, leaving Stephen Gore standing on the footway, with the wind blowing his periwig about his face. He stood there for half a minute, watching a faint shadow melt into the night. Then he seemed to steady himself like a tree between the gusts of a storm, and, turning, walked on slowly toward his house. But Stephen Gore did not sleep in Westminster that night, for he went alone into the stable when the grooms had gone and the servants were in bed, and saddled and bridled a horse with his own hands. He had thrown his periwig into a corner, put on the oldest clothes he could find, to ride out like a sturdy crop-head of a Britisher daring enough to venture on the rounds at such an hour. Pistols, money, and food he took with him, and leading his horse out into the street, went away at a brisk trot into the black chasm of the night. He might be knocked out of the saddle at any corner, but Stephen Gore hazarded the chance, since he might be given an axe or a halter for his badge. End of chapter 34. Chapter 35 of Mad Barbara by Warwick Deeping. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 35. Chris Jennifer was too busy a man to worry his slow brain greatly over other people's affairs, for when a man farms for the children who shall come after him, he can give all the daylight to the land, and trudge home to feed and sleep without much communion with the philosophers and poets. There is always work upon a farm, save for those who have sore heels and a chronic thorn in the forefinger. For these autumn and winter months ploughing, hedging, ditching, carting faggots and stacking them for the winter, spreading the muck abroad, taking odd carpentering jobs in hand, to say nothing of the feeding and tending of sheep and cattle, the fattening of pigs and bullocks for Christmas, the trapping of vermin, and the netting of the accursed coney. Chris Jennifer's most luminous moment was after a rat hunt about the barns and outhouses. To take by the tail the carcasses of sundry strapping rats and heap them in a funeral pile was an act that made Mr. Jennifer feel that Satan can be confounded in this world, and his imps punished for stealing a farmer's corn. For if Chris Jennifer hated anything it was a rat, and next to the rat he hated couch-grass, while the purple-polled thistle came in a bad third. When Mrs. Winnie's husband went to bed he slept the deep, sonorous sleep of a round-headed peasant whose lungs had been breathing in clean air all day, and not even the fact that John Gore had borrowed his best rope, and that his wife was dabbling her hands in affairs that did not concern her, could keep Master Christopher awake and talking. All he had deigned to hope was that us be not going again the law, and that this fine gentleman ben't feeding on hot pie-crust. Then he drew his nightcap down, turned on his right side, and went to sleep with the ease of a dog. Mrs. Winnie, being a woman, and more impressionable and imaginative, remained very wakeful all that night, thinking of all manner of strange adventures, and not a little afraid of John Gore's neck. She had banked the kitchen hearth up with logs, left some supper on the table, and the door unbarred, so that there should be some welcome for him if he came home after bedtime. Yet in spite of all this satisfying forethought she kept awake to listen, and even when she dropped away toward Christopher's oblivion, Mrs. Winnie came to with a start, thinking that she had heard sounds. Daylight came, with a west wind swishing in the beech trees and making a low murmur in the chimney, and the adventurer had not returned. Mrs. Winnie jerked an elbow into her man's back, rose up, and began to dress. She was down and at work in the kitchen getting the fire alight before Chris Jennifer got a very stout pair of legs out of the bed. Mrs. Winnie had piled up the fire, lit the dry brushwood under it, and was kneeling to help the blaze with the bellows, when the door swung open and John Gore walked in. He looked muddy as to the boots and breeches, and rather white about the face, like a man who has been out long in the cold, though his eyes had a quiet steadfastness
that proved he had no pallor at the heart. Winnie Jennifer twisted round on her knees. "Body of me, sir, you are here at last. I've been kep' awake most of the night through thinking o' you and listening." He smiled down at her, and when he smiled the mystery that was in him seemed to glow and to exult in a way that made Mrs. Winnie hanker for her own days of being courted. "You should not have troubled your head about me, Mrs. Jennifer." The fire was blazing now, making a brave crackle, and John Gore looked at it as though he were cold and empty and dead tired. Mrs. Winnie was up and bustling in an instant. "Sit you down, sir. Why, bless my heart, you must be cold and damp as a dish–clout, to see to your horse. I've seen to him myself, Mrs. Winnie." She pushed forward the great box of a chair that was padded with horsehair and leather, and had been polished to a rare sheen by her husband's breeches. "Just you pull off your boots, sir, and rub yourself dry. I'll have something hot in 10 minutes, and a dish of bacon and some eggs." She was bustling with curiosity as well as with good will, for there was something in the man's manner that told of mystery and of strange things accomplished, and perhaps of looking deep into other eyes. He sat down obediently before the fire, and, pulling off his boots, spread himself to the blaze. Overhead they could hear the stumping of Chris Jennifer's feet as he tumbled into his clothes with decent circumlocutions. Mrs. Winnie came to hang the kettle on the chain, and while she was bending forward, with the firelight on her face, John Gore sat forward in his chair and laid a hand upon her shoulder. "I am giving you a great deal of trouble, Mrs. Jennifer," he said. "Dear life, no, sir." "Can I ask you to do something more for me?" She knelt and looked around at him, her honest, comely face perfectly trustful. "To be sure, sir." "Then I must make my terms with you." "You can talk of them, sir, though I may not be for the listening of them when you have told me what you wish." John Gore sat back in the chair again, his eyes on the fire. "Mrs. Jennifer, I want some one whom I can trust. I want to bring her to you here, away from people who wish her out of the world." Mrs. Winnie took up the poker and made a thrust or two at the fire. "It's good of you, sir, to give me the honour." "There shall be no danger to you or others, I can promise that." "There, sir, I was not thinking of any such thing. We're only farming folk, and the lady may have prettier notions than—" He bent forward suddenly and looked into her face. "She would bless you, Mrs. Winnie, as I should, for the very warmth of a fire. She has not felt the warmth of a fire this month or more, and she is half starved into the bargain." Mrs. Jennifer opened her eyes with indignation. "What! Not a stick of fire? Who be they that have the caring of her? And no victuals?" "Then you will let me bring her here if I can?" "Dear heart, sir, yes. I'll have my best blankets out, and make cakes and pasties. And perhaps she would like a nice young pullet, sir. We will put her in the parlour ingle–nook, and melt her heart, and give her stuff to make the colour come." John Gore held out a hand. "You do not know how I thank you for this. But there are my terms to be considered." "Oh, get along, sir." "I shall pass over to you 3 gold pieces a week." Mrs. Winnie looked ready to scoff and laugh. "3 sixpences would be nearer the mark, sir. Why, Jem and Sam and Nicholas, our men, wouldn't eat and drink a third of that in 7 whole days." "Never mind your men, Mrs. Jennifer." "Not mind them, and where should we be in 6 months, the lazy loons? No, I tell you, sir." John Gore tried her on another quarter. "Very well, Mrs. Winnie, take the money and put it in a stocking for your boy." "But, sir—" "Take it, or turn me out of the door. I hold to your good will and your trust with all my heart, but live on you I will not, just because I happened to pull the youngster out of the pond." The woman gave the fire 3 more pokes. "I wouldn't do anything to hurt you, sir." "Then you will put the money aside for the child's sake." Mr. Christopher Jennifer had had great faith in his wife's wisdom ever since she had elected to marry him in preference of a gay sprig of a harness–maker at Lewes, a gallant who could write verses after the fashion of a gentleman, and who had deigned to dazzle both with dress and address. Chris Jennifer, in his courting days and season of rivalry, had fallen violently foul of this same harness–man for the love of Mrs. Winnie. Chris, who had never been a quarrelsome man, had put his bristles up at the last under the provocation of his rival's genteel and foppish impertinence. He had led the harness–man by the ear into the back–yard of Mrs. Winnie's father's house, and there had smitten him, and in the smiting had won his way to Winnie's heart; for she was a woman who must have strength of a kind in a man, and silence and shrewd sense, nor could she abide a ranter or a puff–bag, nor a fellow who was always talking big about the gentry, and telling how he had dined at the justice's table. Men with long tongues were not after her fancy, seeing that length of tongue generally goes with a league of silly vanity and boasting, and that men who talk much are still talking while your quiet man has ploughed his furrow. Therefore, when Mrs. Winnie threw out a downright hint to her man that Gentleman John was likely to bring his lady–love to Furze Farm, and insisted upon putting sundry gold pieces into son William's pocket, Mr. Jennifer humped and nodded, and supposed there would be no harm in it, if t' parson be not left out in t' cold. Mrs. Winnie snubbed him for his sneaking prudery, and protested that he had no wits in him to see when a gentleman was of clean, brave blood, and the very stock of honour. "The lad's in love, Chris, as a lad should be, though he be past 30 by the set of his jaw and mouth. He ben't one of your gillyflower gentlemen, prancing along and tweaking his chin to and fro to see how the women fall to him. It be none of my business to spy and to speculate, but the woman he be after, Chris, must be a woman worth winning." Mr. Jennifer was heaving a couple of faggots into the wood–shed while his wife dropped these suggestions into his ear. Son William had been sent out with a basket to pick blackberries, and the men were down in the fields. "I hope it be nothing against law, Willie." "Go on, you great coward." "Wha, my dear?" "When ye smacked Peter Tinsel in the mouth that day for love of me, did ye think of the law, Chris?" He stood and looked at her with a slow, broadening grin, as though he were proud of her cleverness and her courage. "T' law be damned, that were what I told Peter Tinsel." Mrs. Winnie stuck out her elbows as though to express the word "exactly." But her husband came up to her and kissed her on the mouth with a manly vigour that swept away any sense of superiority on her part. Mrs. Jennifer was busy over many things that day, seeing that Furze Farm might be turned into a refuge for romance, and that she had people of quality to cook for. Yet she found time to have a short gossip or two with John Gore over the parlour fire, and that which struck her most was the grim foreshadowing of something in his eyes, as though he had an enemy to meet, or a debt to wipe out in the cause of honour. Had Mrs. Winnie been able to read his thoughts as he sat before the fire and cleaned his pistols after sending the bullets splashing into the pond, she would have hugged her bosom and have understood that grim look about his eyes and mouth. For in the silence of the night, and amid the wet black woods where he had seen the dawn gather, John Gore had suffered a revelation that would have made any man's heart heavy and ashamed. He had never greatly loved his father, nor had they ever trusted each other with the inner intimacies of life. Yet a son cannot lay bare his begetter's true nature without recoiling from it when he beholds rottenness and hidden sores. The tragedy was so plain to him, so terribly simple now, that the scattered rays of his conjectures had been gathered by the burning glass of truth, and John Gore had ridden into Furze Farm that morning with the cold raw air of the wet woods in his blood, and the heart numb in him but for the thought of Barbara. The warmth of the fire and a tankard of ale had driven some of the poisonous taste from under his tongue, but the truth galled him like a bone in the throat, filling him with wrath and shame and pity. Mrs. Winnie found herself called upon to provide more tools for him that day, and after some rummaging in an oak locker in the harness–room, she found him what he needed, namely, a file and a half–inch auger. He also borrowed the pillion on which Christopher Jennifer took his wife to market at Battle, Hailsham, or Robertsbridge. By reason of these details, Mrs. Winnie understood that the romance was deepening to a crisis, and though she kept her tongue to herself in the matter of asking questions, she cordially commended John Gore in his prison–breaking, having a hearty contempt for authority when true sentiment was threatened. While John Gore rode through the woods when the evening mists began to dim the splendour of the trees so that they were like shrines of gold seen through the drift of incense, Simon Pinniger sat in the kitchen at Thorn, drinking to get his temper up and his blood hot and muddled against the night. He would spread out his great hands before the fire and look at them with a kind of sottish pride, keeping an uneasy eye on the woman Nance, who in turn kept a keen eye on him. "What's it to be, Sim?" she asked, with the air of one who must keep a surly dog in good temper with himself. The man drew off a great red neckerchief that he was wearing, made a loop, and, putting one fist through it, drew the ends tight with his teeth at the other end. "That's my trick," he said, dropping the end from his mouth. "Them Spaniards have a liking for it, and Spaniards are particular in the playing of such tricks." Chapter 36 of Mad Barbara by Warwick Deeping. Chapter 36. There was to be a moon that night, and the thickets were black at sunset against the cold yellow of a winter sky. Frost hung in the air, with a gusty, arid northeast wind that came sweeping south with the sense of coming snow, while great purple cloud banks loomed slowly into the north. The grass was already stiffening, and the leaves made a dry, thin rattle as John Gore drew up in the beech thicket over against Thorn. He had brought an extra cloak with him, and a loin-cloth for his horse, and after some searching he found a little hollow where dead bracken stood, and where the beast would be sheltered from the wind. He buckled the bridle about a young ash, whose black buds and branches stood out against the sky. John Gore took his sword, pistols, and tools into Thorn with him that night, tying them up in the end of a red scarf, and swinging them after him as he straddled the gate. He hid the sword and one pistol in the ivy at the foot of the tower, and set out on a reconnaissance, holding close under the deep shadow of the walls, and keeping a long knife ready in case the dog should be loose and on the prowl. There was a faint silvery glow low in the eastern sky, but no moon as yet, and John Gore, meeting the keen north wind, thought of Barbara in that cold room, and felt his heart warm to her, and to Mrs. Winnie, as he remembered the blazing kitchen at Furze Farm. Probing about in the dusk, he found the doorway that led into the ruined hall, and into the corner of the hall the rough stone stair and door that gave access to the tower. It might have seemed simpler to have set to work straight away upon that door, but he chose the safer, slower method of forcing the window and then working from within. The rope was dangling from within reach when John Gore returned to the foot of the tower, and he went up it hand over hand with the tools slung behind him by the scarf. He was soon under Barbara's window, where the rope ran taut over the sill, and reaching in for a grip of the bars, he called to her in a whisper. "I am here, John, waiting." He felt the wind on his back, and guessed how miserably cold that room must be. "Poor heart, the room must be numb in you." "No, John, not quite." "Let me have your hands, dear." He lay in on the window-ledge with his face against the bars, and stretched his arms in. His hands groped for hers and found them, and of a truth they were like ice. "Why, my life, you are all a shiver." She was shuddering a little, half with the cold, half with a deep thrill from within. "No, it is not only the cold, John." "No?" "It is all so strange and hazardous." He held her hands between his, and then began to chafe them to get them warm. "We will soon have you out of this. I have found a warm nest for you, where they pile the wood half-way up the chimney, and look glum if one does not eat more than one needs. You must rest there, Barbe, and forget everything for a while, and let the past die, dear, if you can. I suppose the folk below will not meddle to-night." "No. Yet it is strange, John, they have brought me no food to–day." "No food, child? Why?" "Oh, I had a little bread left." "The brutes! And here am I chattering like a starling instead of getting to work." He drew up the scarf, and unfastening the knot about the tools and pistol, laid them before him on the sill. Then he made a loop in the rope, so that the end should not be left dangling near the ground and betray him in case the man Pinniger were in a vigilant mood. He had brought a rag with a slip of lard in it, and he greased the bar with the fat where the file was to work, so that the tool should make less sound. The steady burr of the steel teeth soon told of their bite upon the rusty metal. The 3 bars were as thick as John Gore's forefinger, but they had rusted away more at the lower ends, where the damp gathered, and the rain had stood in tiny pools. A strong arm would be able to thrust them in after an hour or so's steady filing. Barbara stood on the bed, leaning her arms against the wall and listening to the stubborn rasping of the file. There was a sweetness even in that rough, shrill sound to her, for life and desire were breaking in with strong arms and the beat of a man's heart. She no longer felt the cold, but stood there conscious only of the dearness and mystery of it all, letting a sense of infinite peace steal in. She fell almost into a dreamy, wandering mood like one near to the edge of sleep, hearing him speak to her from time to time. Now and again he would stop and rest, and stretch a hand in between the bars, and she felt him once take a strand of her hair and lay it across his lips. John Gore had filed through one bar and bent it back, when a sudden, clear, ringing sound came up to them out of the silence of the tower, like the clash of something metallic upon stone. Barbara woke from her stupor of dreams like a frightened sentinel, and put up a hand as though in warning. "John, did you hear that?" He had heard it, and hung there with every sense upon the alert, hating the wind that made the ivy rustle. Barbara had stepped down from the bed and crossed the room to the door. She knelt and laid her head to the lock, holding her breath, her lips parted, her eyes at gaze. A vague suggestion of movement came to her from the dark well of the tower stair, a dull, slow, scraping sound that came up and up, with moments of silence in between. There was no glimmer of light as she looked through the keyhole, nothing but that slow, cautious sound, like some big thing crawling in a dark and narrow place. Shivering, her skin a-prickle as with cold, she went back to the window, climbed the bed, and gave the man a whisper. "John, there is some one coming up the stair." "Lie down on the bed, child. I will slip out and wait." She heard the rape chafe slightly against the window ledge as John Gore lowered himself cautiously so as to be out of view. He hung there as a sailor can, with feet and knees gripping the rope, and one hand on the butt of the pistol that he had thrust into his belt. He had left the tools on the window-sill, and no one would see them or the knotted rope about the bar unless they climbed up from the bed to look. Hanging there, with the wind shaking the ivy, he could hear no sound in the tower and see no glimmer of light coming from the squints. The rising moon was beginning to throw gleams down into the valley, but the western quarter of the tower was as dark as a well. It was a moment when a man may feel scared by some vague, indefinite peril invisible to him in the darkness, or he may clinch his teeth and keep his right hand ready, knowing, if he be a man who has had his share of adventure-hunting, that his own imagination may be far more sinister than any living thing on earth or sea. There was a sudden faint click like the twist of a turned lock, a sound that made John Gore lift his chin heavenward and listen with both ears. Then came a slow whine, as though an unoiled hinge were turning. The door of Barbara's room had been opened. He had no doubt of that. Probably she was feigning sleep, thinking that one of my lord's creatures had come to see that all was safe. A harsh gust of wind shook the ivy on the wall, making John Gore curse the leaves for setting up such a flutter. But above the rustling of the ivy he heard an abrupt and half-smothered cry, and then the sound as of people struggling. The bed creaked. There was an inarticulate choking, as of someone striving to call for help through the smothering folds of a cloak. The black room within seemed full of movement, of piteous effort, of hoarse, savage whisperings that made his mane bristle like a furious dog's. He gave one shout as a challenge and a warning, and then slid down the rope without heeding how it chafed his hands. Plucking out his sword and pistol from the ivy at the foot of the tower, he ran for the doorway that led from the terrace into the hall, his face meeting the moonlight that poured down through a broken window. End of chapter 36.
Chapter 37 of Mad Barbara by Warwick Deeping. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 37. The door at the foot of the tower stood open, and John Gore plunged in with his sword forward and his pistol at the cock. The place was as dark as a pit, and he thrust out right and left with the sword, the point ringing against the walls till he found where the gap of the stairs opened. He went up silently, for he was in his stockings, but there was more grimness in that swift and silent climb than any clangor and clash that armed men might have made. His blood was up, the devil awake in him, and the spirit of murder howling in his ears. He seemed to see all the gross, smothering horror of the scene above, and he set his teeth as he wondered whether he would come too late. A quick shuffling sound came down to him in the darkness. A hurrying human thing was close to him, and John Gore challenged and lunged without pity. There was a hard sob, and a dim shadow of a figure dragged down his sword's point in its fall. He freed the blade, and went on with hardly a thought, as a stormer pushes on over the bodies in the throat of a breach. A sudden gleam of light slanted down the stair, and he heard the tread of heavy feet and a harsh shout of "Nance! Nance!" Rounding the last twist of the stair, John Gore came upon a man with a white cloth over his face, standing on the landing outside Barbara's room and holding a shaded lantern in his hand. There was no parleying between those two, and Simon Pinniger, caught without arms, lifted up the lantern as though to dash it in John Gore's face. The sea captain flung up his left arm, and firing straight into the man's body, saw him go lurching back, the lantern falling at his feet. John Gore sprang up with his sword ready, thinking for the moment that the bully had it in his heart. But Simon Pinniger's ribs were tough enough to turn a pistol bullet, and he recovered himself and came at the rescuer like a bull. He tried to beat the sword aside with a sweep of the arm, but the lantern still burned upon the floor, and John Gore was too grim a gentleman to be tricked so easily. He avoided the blow with a backward step and a swift backswing of the right arm. The point was still to the fore, and lunging with the whole weight of arm and shoulder, he felt the blade grate between the fellow's ribs. Then he was caught full face, like a bluff ship by an ocean roller, and knocked backward down the stairs by the mass and impact of the man's charge. The sword broke a foot from the guard, but John Gore held to the hilt even while the brute bulk of the man was grinding over him down the steps. Twisting free, he slipped aside against the wall, only to feel a hand grasping at his throat, and the sound of hoarse, wet breathing mingling with savage curses. He struck out with the hilt of the sword, broke the man's grip, and came up top dog, despite Simon Pinniger's brute, plunging fury. It was like the death-thrashing of a leviathan amid blood and spray. They struggled, clawed, and smote for a moment, till a chance stab went deep into the fellow's eye. He crumpled down into the darkness. John Gore heard his head strike the wall, and the breath come out of him like the wind out of a stabbed float. The man was mere carrion, and John Gore sprang up the stairs, finding the lantern still burning, though the grease from the candle had guttered through upon the stones. He picked it up, and was about to push forward into the room when a black square in the flooring caught his eye. A flagstone had been turned upon its side against the wall, uncovering the mouth of some oubliette or pit, and for a moment he bent over it, trying to probe its depths, as though dreading lest that dear body should be lying broken in the darkness beneath. A glance through the open door of the room showed him Barbara lying upon the floor, with the bedclothes half covering her as she lay. He was down beside her with a cold sweat of fear on him as the light from the lantern fell upon her face. A red scarf had been wound about her neck, and her two hands were still straining at it, pathetic in their impotence to let in life and breath. John Gore set the lantern down, caught her up, and unwound the thing, cursing as he did so the marks where the white throat had been bruised by brutal hands. There was froth on her lips and dusky shadow covering her face, yet the lips were warm when he pressed his cheeks to them, and, putting an ear to her bosom, he found that her heart still throbbed. An inarticulate "Thank God!" came from him, but the cry of the moment was "Air! Air!" Taking her in his arms, he bent for the lantern, and swinging it by the ring from one finger, he started down the stairs. He hardly heeded the two bodies lying there, save to step over them, and so, with all his manhood, praying and striving for the life in her, he came out into the cold night and the pale gleam of the moon. Now John Gore remembered a trick that an old buccaneer surgeon had taught him at Port Royal, a trick that had saved men who had been cut down from the gallows or pulled out senseless from the sea. He laid Barbara on the wet grass that grew in the old hall, and, kneeling at her head, took her 2 arms at the wrists and began to move them gently from the shoulders, spreading them wide, and then crossing them with slight pressure upon her bosom. Nor did man ever thank God more than did John Gore when she began to breathe feebly of her own sweet self, and the rise and fall of her bosom showed that the tide of life had turned. He bent over her and wiped her lips, touched her bruised throat tenderly with his fingers, and then leaned back and looked at the moon, as though that broad, white, heavenly face could understand what all this meant to him. He lifted her up again in his arms, and seeing a yellow glow beating along the passage that led from the hall into the kitchen, he made for it and made a huge fire blazing on the hearth, the light from it making the place far brighter than in the day. There was a rough sort of couch under the window, and John Gore laid Barbara upon it, and drew the thing up before the fire so that the warmth should hearten the life in her. And then, for the first time, he took notice of the swelter he himself was in, his shirt hanging open and showing his chest, blotches of crimson staining it, his very stockings soaked from the blood of the 2 dead creatures upon the stairs. A man in such a war-tackle was not a savoury thing to meet the eyes of a frightened girl. John Gore bent over her a moment and saw a faint pink flush creeping into her cheeks, while her breath came and went steadily with a quiet sighing. There was an oak chest in the kitchen, and John Gore found some clothes in it, a rough shirt that had belonged to the dead man and some woollen hose. He went out into the yard, where the dog was rattling his chain and making a great whimpering as though calling for his supper, and knowing there was a pump by the stable, he stripped himself to the waist, washed, and put on clean gear. Then he unbarred the gate, and brought in his coat and riding boots from under the thorn-tree, so that he should seem something of a gentleman, and not a ragged scoundrel hardly fit to touch a woman's hand. Barbara was still lying like one asleep before the fire when he returned, for she had been so near to death that life seemed to steal back softly and slowly, as though still afraid. John Gore had never looked thus at his love before, as a man might look at a sleeping child, or at some fair valley under a golden dawn. He saw the faint flush upon her cheeks, the shadowy sweep of the long lashes, the little dark curls of hair falling with such a sheen of sweetness over her forehead, the line of the red mouth, the soft warmth of her skin. She looked thin, poor child, frail and tragical, and yet the suffering that she had borne had shed a glamour over her that made her more lovable and more womanly than of old. His heart went out to her with all the awe of a man's desire as he stood and watched the coming of life and love. There was a fluttering of the shadowy lashes, a long–drawn breath, a movement of the hands, and then the low cry of one waking to some revolting memory. John Gore bent over her and took her hands in his. "There is nothing to fear, dear heart." A shudder ran through her as she looked at him, and some moments passed before light and understanding swept the shadows from her eyes. But the look that came into them when her soul awoke made John Gore long to take her in his arms and to hold her close to him, so that he could feel the beating of her heart. "John, is it you?" She spoke huskily, from the bruising of her throat by Simon Pinniger's murderous hands. "It is all over, Barbe. We are king and queen of the castle." He wished to hide all the grimness of the night's work from her, seeing that her great eyes were ready to grow frightened and full of fear, showing that she had borne too much already in body and soul. "John, I remember it all now. They were smothering me in the dark." He took her face between his 2 hands and looked dearly into her eyes. "Barbara, you are in my keeping. Try and forget all that, dear heart. I came in time to scare those wolves into the night. Now you must suffer me to have my way." Barbara looked up at him almost timidly, as though conscious of his nearness and the homage in his eyes. It had been dark in the tower window,
But now they saw each other in the light, and a mysterious coyness covered her face. "I will do all that you wish, John." "I shall take you away to-night." "Yes, yes, take me away from Thorn." Her hands went into his. "There is a moon, dear, and I have a pillion for you, if you are strong enough." "Oh, yes, I am quite strong now." She made as though to sit up on the couch, but she grew faint instantly, so that John Gore held her with one arm about her shoulders. "More spirit than strength, Barbe, yet." Some of her old obstinacy appeared in her for the moment. "No, I am only a little giddy." "Lie down again." "No, I must make a start." She dropped her feet in their worn shoes over the edge of the couch, glanced at him a little wilfully, and then looked away with a rush of colour and a tremulous flash of the eyes. "You must try and be patient with me, John." "It is not a matter of patience, child, but food and good wine." She put a hand to her throat. "I could not touch anything in this place." He looked at her with a smile. "Not even if it came in my pocket?" "I will try, John." "Of course you will. I have work to do here before we start." He brought out a flask from his pocket, and food that Mrs. Winnie had wrapped up in a clean white napkin. There were some little cakes, and some baked meat laid in slices between slips of home-made bread. Barbara looked at them, and gave him a first sad smile. "It is gross of me, John, but those cakes make me feel hungry." "The very best confession, dear." "Will you have some?" He had laid the cloth upon her knees. "No, child, not yet. Can you bear to be left alone awhile?" "I am quite brave now, John, but—" "Well, sweetheart?" "You are not going far?" "No, only into the tower to get the rope which is not mine to leave. Is there anything that you would wish to take?" She looked down thoughtfully, her dark lashes sweeping her cheeks. "There is a book, John, bound in red leather. I would not leave it here, because it has helped me, taught me, almost as much as you have done." End of Chapter 37. Chapter 38 of Mad Barbara by Warwick Deeping. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 38. John Gore had grim things on his mind that night, and a task before him that he did not wish to come to Barbara's knowledge. She, poor child, with Mrs. Winnie's food in her lap, food such as she had not touched for many a day, would have had no heart to eat and drink had she known of the dead on those dark stairs. He wished to spare her the horror of it, for the night had been gross and violent enough, and after all the suffering she had borne he was afraid for her in body and mind. Taking the lantern, he made his way to the tower, closing the door in the passage that led from the kitchen into the ruined hall. Nance Pinniger lay dead upon the stairs, her mouth open and her hands clinched over the place where the sword had entered, and John Gore shuddered as he looked at her, wishing, for the sake of her womanhood, that he had held his hand. He went higher to where the man lay half doubled against the wall, the cloth that covered his face caught between his teeth in the death spasm. The fellow's bulk seemed a veritable barrier against burial, and John Gore, hardened as he had been to the rough life of the sea, felt a vital horror of this huddled mass that seemed gross and gluttonous even in death. Remembering the open pit, he went and held the lantern over the black hole in the floor, but was still unable to fathom its depth. Here was a ready vault if he could but get the dead to it, a pit that seemed to scoff with open mouth at those whom fate had cheated. To make short work of a grisly business, even as John Gore did, he took one of the sheets from Barbara's room, and knotting it about the dead man's ankles, contrived, thanks to his great strength, to draw the body to the edge of the pit. Unknotting the sheet, he turned Simon Pinniger down into the darkness, handling him daintily so as not to foul his own clothes. For the woman he underwent a like labour, letting the bloody sheet slip after her, and turning the flag down into its place. He had the feelings of a man who had played scavenger to a headsman upon a scaffold,
and he still seemed to hear the soughing rush of wind from the pit as those dead things went to their last resting-place in the secret depths of thorn. When he had drawn the rope up from the window, unknotted and coiled it, and gathered tools, pistols, and his broken sword, he searched for and found Barbara's red Bible, and retreated, with all his gear, out of the tower. The memory of the place made his gorge rise, and he was glad of the night air and the light of the moon. He drove his feet through some clumps of grass and weeds, yearning to wipe off every stain of the place before taking this child out into the world. In the kitchen he found Barbara warming herself before the fire, and the spirit of maidenhood in her, the smooth virginal contours of her face and figure, filled him with a sense of freshness and of awe. He saw the play and counterplay of shadow and light within her eyes, and held it to be witchcraft miraculously pure and sweet, bringing down God to him, and beauty and clean living. Somehow he felt that night that he could not go close to her, that he had a butcher's hands, and that it would be impiety to touch a thing so goodly. Moreover, there was a delight in holding a little aloof from her, in watching all her half-coy sweetness, so fresh and new to him in her altered womanhood. He could mark the shade and sunlight of her glances, the passing gleams of colour on her face, the birth of that dear consciousness that strove to smother that which could not be wholly hid. "How long you have been, John!" "I had dropped some of my things and had to hunt for them. I found your book." He gave it to her, and throwing the ropes and the tools upon the table, he busied himself with reloading the pistol that had sent its lead into Simon Pinniger's body, having a small ivory powder-horn and a bag of bullets with him. "I heard such strange sounds, John, while you were away." "Oh?" And he seemed intent on ramming home the charge. "It was like something falling in a cellar under the house." "Old houses are full of such sounds," he said, looking up at her suddenly. "Thorn sheds bricks and plaster most nights in the year, with the ivy working its way everywhere." Gore began to gather up all that belonged to him, and finding a sack in one of the cupboards, he tumbled the tools and rope into it, tying the mouth of the sack with a strip of stuff torn from the quilt of the couch. His own sword was broken in its scabbard, so he took the hanger down that hung over the fireplace, and also the long carbine that had a strap for slinging across the back. John Gore had brought the horseman's cloak with him from under the thorn-tree, and he took it and laid it upon Barbara's shoulders. Moreover, Mrs. Winnie had lent him a woollen scarf and some gloves, which he had stowed away in the bottom of his holsters, and he knew that the girl would need them because of the keen wind. "I have left the horse in the woods, Barbe. What sort of shoes are you wearing?" She showed him them, and he did not commend their flimsiness. "You must let me carry you, child, or you will have your stockings soaked in those boggy meadows, and we shall be some while on the road." She glanced at the table where the sack and the arms lay, and then gave him an unequivocal smile. "And you think you can carry me as well as all that, John?" "It can be done." "I'm not so selfish as that. I have stolen your cloak already." "There is another on the horse." "Instead of carrying me, John, give me something to carry." He looked at the thin hands she held out to him. "There is your book." "Yes, but I can take more than that." "As for that, we will see what the grass is like when we get over the moat." They went out together into the courtyard, where the moonlight came down upon the chequer of stones outlined and interlaced with grass and weeds. Above them rose the black tower, dark as with mystery, while on every hand dim silvery hills rode toward the frosty curtain of the sky. "I had forgotten the dog." The mastiff had come out from the old cask that served him as a kennel, and was clanking his chain over the stones and growling. "Some one will find him, John. They may come back when we have gone." But John Gore knew better. He did not like the thought of leaving the beast chained there to starve, and he was debating whether a pistol bullet would not be the kinder end, when something far more hazardous challenged his attention.
The wind was beating about Thorn, shaking the ivy on the walls, while the clank of the dog's chain had a suggestive ghostliness. Yet beyond these sounds came the dull, rhythmic thud of a horse trotting over stiffening turf, the muffled cadence coming down upon the wind as they stood in the court of Thorn and listened. "Quick, dear, we must play at hide-and-seek. It is that fellow Grylls riding back again." They were close to the open gate at the moment, and John Gore took Barbara by the hand and drew her aside along the wall to where a stunted bush had made roots and grown despite the stones. He pressed Barbara back within its shadow, and stood covering her, a pistol ready, and the hanger at his belt should he need cold steel. "Not a sound, Barby. Be ready to slip away when I take your hand." They could hear the steady thud of hoofs over the grass, and even the heavy breathing of the beast, as though he had been pushed and bustled by the spur. John Gore guessed that his rider was skirting along the moat. Then came the sharper clatter of the iron shoes upon the timbers of the bridge. The dog set up a savage barking, and in the moonlight they saw a man ride into the court of Thorn, steam rising from his horse like smoke, so that the beast looked huge and spectral. The man himself, though outlined against the moon, showed nothing but the sweep of a cloak and the droop of a black beaver. He sat motionless a moment in the saddle, and then, dismounting, led his horse by the bridle toward the mist of light that came from the archway leading into the kitchen. John Gore felt for Barbara's hand, and they glided along the wall toward the gate, for the man's back was toward them, while the barking of the dog and his grinding against the chain drowned the sound of their footsteps utterly. They made the gate, and went out hand in hand over the bridge and away over the moonlit grassland, with the barking of the dog dying down into a hoarse whimper. John Gore had thrust the pistol in his belt and swung the sack over his shoulder. He put his right arm about Barbara's body and swept her along by main strength toward the towering beech trees that shone in the moonlight, while the seal of silence seemed over Thorn. End of Chapter 38